Among the concerning reports in our state prisons of drugs, re-entries, and some DOC staff members being arrested comes now a ray of hope.
Beth Warden brings us inside a program funded by grants and private donations run by South Dakotans that is providing measurable results to build a new life for inmates.
South Dakota-based company Think3D has inspired and motivated many in the business community. One of their programs, Leaders of Tomorrow.
Which is taking the same content we give to our corporate clients, your First Mirror Banks, your Veras, and asked how can we make it accessible to everyone, no matter what background they come from.
Leaders of Tomorrow branched into cohorts for many avenues, including education, where Don Marie Johnson took the program. Founder Tamian Dysart started thinking about his childhood.
My dad spent the first number of years of my life inside prison, and I have a lot of family members who have been inside of prison, and so I know what it's like growing up here in Sioux Falls, kind of feeling like I didn't have a chance, like I didn't belong.
So in 2021, they launched the first Leaders of Tomorrow Justice Impacted cohort for those inside the penitentiary.
Really based in, the neuroscience of if you change the way someone thinks, you can change their lives.
Inmates' lives began to change.
And people are leaving their gangs.
Yeah.
Literally.
The multi-faith group witnessed strongholds being broken.
That's the hardest part, is breaking from family. And in order to heal, that's what they had to do. The new community, through Leaders of Tomorrow, people are lifelong friends and they stay connected.
Mm-hmm.
Stats confirm the change.
Overall, our recidivism rate in general is around 75%, give or take. That basically someone who commits crime will reoffend at some point. Not everyone goes back to prison because sometimes it's just minor offenses. So Daniel Hagar, the current state's attorney for Minnehaha County, is tracking recidivism amongst our graduates, and it's less than 34%.
Some of the earliest attendees now lead others, have formed companies after their release, setting goals for themselves and their community.
For them to open up to us and trust us is such an honor.
The program is funded by grants and private donations. One of their greatest needs is finding companies willing to give a second chance to a former inmate and hire them, which can be a lifeline to setting up a new life and not returning to the old ways out of desperation.
We can truly become best in class, and what if we're just dreaming bigger? What if we did?
Both Dysart and Johnson say that they are equipped to expand. Some of the family members have noticed such a change in their loved ones still serving time that they have taken the course. In Sioux Falls, Beth Warden, Dakota News Now.